Hello, and we are back. Thank you again for tuning in to the daily reading. Currently, these are being recorded for the Festive Spirit blog hop hosted by Francis H. Powell. We are currently reading Dolor and Shadow by Angela B. Chrysler, myself, the author and publisher. I have rights to do this. And we will be reading chapter 15 today. And yeah, that's it. So I'll go ahead and get started. I know too well the shadows that lurk within. I've spent most of my life looking into empty faces, every one of them veiled with the same deadened look. I've seen the insatiable rage that comes next. Rune searched the darkness and dropped his shoulders. Despite his training, he found no trail. The blue of her eyes were as dazzling as the lapis gem Bergen had brought from the eastern roads, eyes he would soon forget. "Your Majesty!" the scout shouted, his voice on the edge of panic. Rune turned his back to the wood where the girl had been standing a moment ago. "What word, Jorn?" he asked, pulling the gloves from his hands. Panting, the scout emerged, dressed in light leather armor and covered in a layer of dust from the road and a hard ride. "Dagafar," Jorn said. "She's here." "Who's here?" he asked, fixing his attention on Jorn. "Queen Kallan." The words dumped a cold chill down Rune's back, pushing all thoughts of the maiden aside. "When?" Rune said. "Dawn," Jorn said, with a rising sun. Rune looked to the sky. Daylight would be upon them. "And the Sidkona?" he asked, his deepest worry setting in. Jorn was already nodding. "She rides with them." He closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose. The silver of his signet ring shimmered. "Where is Bergen?" "2 days' ride from here," Jorn said. "Even if I leave now, I won't catch him in time." The last of Rune's hope vanished as the forest spun around him. For the first time in a year, he saw everything and understood. "By the fires of Muspelheim," he cursed, opening his eyes. "She planned this?" "My king?" Jorn asked. "All of it!" Rune crammed his gloves onto his belt. "A fight alongside Roll left us too weak to send aid to Thorold. We had no choice but to send Bergen. She knew he wouldn't be back in time to defend the valley, and we too would be too few in number here, too weak in arms to stop her. The march alone left us too weak to battle, and she knew this. And now she strikes, when we are most vulnerable." Jorn was whiter than the moonlight on his face. "But how did she find the valley? We don't stand a chance against that Sidkona of hers without him." Rune shook his head at the hindsight, deaf to Jorn's question. "I hate that bitch." "But we won the Battle of the Southern Keep, and lost significant numbers in the process," Rune said. "By keeping the Southern Keep, we have lost the valley and the war." In silence, they stood, battling back waves of panic. They were dead if they retreated to Gunir, and dead if they stayed to fight. They were dead without Bergen's army. "We can fall back to Gunir," Jorn said, desperate to stop the inevitable. In silence, Rune reviewed his options. His knuckles popped as he tightened his fist, detesting the options the Sidkona had left him. After a moment, he settled on the one choice that would move him, where he knew the queen wanted him. The Dagafar come for Gunir's king," Rune said. "If not in the valley, then they will march to Gunir, across the Claralf, and rend her realms." "The Dagafar come for Gunir's king," Rune said. "If not in the valley, then they will march to Gunir, cross the Claralf, and rend her walls. They will take me from my city through the spilled blood of Gunir's children and her daughters if they have to. No!" Rune shook his head. "We will stay in the valley, and we will face the Sidkona without Bergen." Sweat glistened on Jorn's brow. "But how? With Bergen gone? I don't know." Rune rubbed his hand over his face as he scrambled to collect a thought. "Carry word to Bergen. He must be warned of the massacre he'll find when he gets here. I will return to Schwandal and ready the army for battle. If we can hold them off long enough, maybe we can. Maybe Bergen will arrive in time. But it's 2 days' ride at least," Jorn said. "He won't make it. Regardless of how quickly I move, Bergen won't make it to the valley in time. We have to do something!" A bird screeched, wrestling the trees as it flew. "The Dagafar queen has positioned everything flawlessly. They marched to slay Gunir's king. No matter how we assemble the pieces, I shall fall in the end." The declaration of his death sparked a wild determination within. "If it is my head she comes for, then she shall have it," Rune said. "But the price of my head is the heart of her Sidkona. If I fall, so shall her servant. I will cut that Sidkona's heart from her chest with my sword. Without her, Bergen will have a fighting chance to reach the queen." Rune's words ignited the same fighting spark in Jorn, and the scout lifted his head with a want to prevail. Nodding, Jorn disappeared into the trees, ready for the 2-day ride to the Northern Watch and Bergen. Rune glanced over his shoulder, hopeful to see what he knew wasn't there. When he caught sight of the dead boar forgotten on the ground, it seemed like only a different time and place when he had killed it only a few moments ago. The casual curiosity that impelled him to follow the maiden paled in comparison to the dread he saw in her eyes. Too well he knew that darkness. Too well he knew the hole it would leave as it ate its way through her. Too many memories of his own raced back as he shook his head at the boar. There was no time to drag a 400-pound boar from the forest and dress it. After administering Frey's blessing upon the animal and grieving the wasted life taken, Rune followed Jorn into the trees. He vowed to come back for it later if he survived the day. Kallan bit the side of her bottom lip, cursing her own foolishness as she rode. The Dockful camp came into view where barely a corner of light from her tent was visible, and she pulled back the reins, slowing Astrid to a light canter. In a matter of minutes she slid from the saddle, tethered the reins to a tree, and stroked the horse's dark bay coat. The stallion snorted and nuzzled Kallan's waist. "I'm sorry, Astrid," she said. "I don't have my pouch with me." Mindlessly she patted the horse's brown nose and added a kiss to the velvet as he snuffled for an apple. Her insides twisted with the pressing dawn. She gave a final pat on Astrid's neck and slunk unseen toward her tent. A different silence filled the wood, and Kallan turned to the forest. Excuse me. Desperate to see through the dark, she ignited her palms with save flame and studied the black silhouettes of foliage and pines behind Astrid. Her heart pounded through the silence, converting her panic to patience. She scanned the shapeless black that rustled in the Nordic winds. She could feel them. So this time, she was certain of the nameless spirits that watched from the trees. If only she could see them. "Where are you?" she whispered, scanning the blackest darkness. Astrid pawed at the ground and shook his head, disturbed by an invisible pest. The leather bridle slapped the branch, the metallic jingle of the bit broke the tension in the air, and with it, the weight of the shadow's eyes. In that instant, the tension released, and the forest returned to its calm. Sighing, Kallan extinguished her flame and dropped her hands. She studied the trees a moment longer, until she was certain that whatever it was that had been there was gone. Without a second glance to Astrid, Kallan pulled back the tent's flap. The fire crackled in the center of the room, filling the air with a stuffy warmth. Eric, like a large tattooed sentry, brooded by the fire. Saying nothing and paying him no mind, Kallan strolled to her bed and sat down on the furs. 1 hour, Your Majesty, Eric said. Kallan clenched her teeth at the formal title, but kept her head bent over her boot as she unlaced the leather strings. 1 hour, he said. Could you please explain why the Queen of the White Opal could not be found until 1 hour before battle? Her foot smacked the floor, and Kallan raised her fearless eyes to Eric. A queen's head is worth its weight in gold, Eric said, as Kallan studied the newest of black lettering etched into his shoulder. She shrugged at the statement and loosened the laces on her boot. So I went for a ride, she said. On Astrid. Kallan dropped her boot to the floor and crossed the bearskin rug to the table at the opposite end of the room, knowing where this was going. Pulling the chair from the desk, she dropped herself down. Kallan looked over the mortar filled with powdered sage, the pestles she hadn't cleaned yet, and numberless herbs scattered about until she located the single most precious possession laid out before leaving. Astrid is the only horse of his kind, Eric said. You know that, and the enemy has long since learned to associate his presence with you, Shaith Kona. He all but growled the word. He'll be the first to betray you. If he's seen, she said, fastening her mother's necklace around her neck. I used a spell on him, she added before Eric could roar a rebuttal. Well, thank the gods you had sense enough for that, he said. Hoping to discourage Eric's well-rehearsed rant, Kallan ignored the lecture and gathered the maps from the floor. She gently splayed them over the supplies, careful to not spill the inkwell she had abandoned earlier, along with the paperwork. Eric relaxed his shoulders. The raging sea had ebbed. Kallan, he said. We were worried. We. The lone word caught her ear, and she peered over her shoulder. You told Gudrun. Eric narrowed his eyes. Gudrun taught you that spell. Do you think I had to tell Gudrun? She didn't have time to answer before a chill swept the room. Throwing back the tent flap, Dagon entered, followed by a streak of silver and a flash of gold. Where is she? The old woman said. I'll kill her! Behind her, Dagon propped the tent flap. Pushing out her thinned bottom lip, Gudrun looked Kallan over from her feet to her face. Gudrun grimaced. You've met someone! Kallan felt her face burn red as Eric took his leave, shaking his head. Dagon shifted his eyes, feigning interest in the sword on Kallan's bed, as Gudrun burrowed her fierce golden stare into Kallan. Well, that explains that, the old woman said, not noticing the change of tension in the air. Dagon, Kallan said, doing her best to divert the subject to the captain's corner of the room. Where is the Dark One? Just 2 days' ride from here, Dagon said, eager for the change in topic himself. With a nod, Kallan averted her attention back to the map. Gudrun's eyes peered closer to better scrutinize every movement of Kallan's face. "Who is he?" "Woman!" Dagon howled from across the room. "I've my rights!" she spat back. Kallan's face flushed a deeper red as she bit her lip and shuffled to bed. In silence she stared at the orange light splayed across the silver-black blades, remembering her father's smile. Deeper into darkness her memory pulled her as she ignored the bickering that unfolded between Dagon and Gudrun. Her mind drifted as far from her room as her meandering thoughts could take her, where the cold slowed her grief until it stopped. There, deep in the back of her mind, buried behind an iron-black wall, Kallan couldn't feel. There she ceased to remember. "Kallan!" Dagon's gentle voice didn't reach her. Flames flickered in the silence, casting shadows Kallan didn't see. She was somewhere else, stretched deep in the darkness of her mind, where images lurked as she drew the blanket of cold around her, slipping further into the void, numbing her emotions, shutting him out, shutting everything out. A gentle hand brushed her shoulder, jolting Kallan back to hear Dagon's consolation. "It was not your fault," he said. She flinched as his words drove a sharp pang through her. "There was nothing you could have done to save him," Dagon said. Kallan's eyes burned and the walls thickened, rising higher than before. She couldn't breathe. "No!" she gasped. Tears burned her eyes. Her lip quivered. "Shutting yourself in will not bring him back," he said. His words sliced their way deeper through the wall, and a scream caught in her throat. Kallan threw her hands to her head and dug her nails into her scalp, desperate to shut out the memories that flooded back. A stream of blood flowed down her face, but she only felt her heart ache as she remembered her father's laughter. Kallan's hands wouldn't move. Dagon held her wrists, and he pulled her hands from her head. There he held her, staring inches from her space. He had stopped talking, and neatly, Kallan tucked the images and memories back behind the wall, where they were safe and she could breathe again. "Leave me," she said, shaking beneath her rage. Anger flushed her face, where tears refused to flow, and Dagon searched her hardened gaze. "I still see the soft, gentle princess who broke every rule and jest, and pilfered my wardrobe for clothes in which to dress the orphans," Dagon whispered. "Where are you, Kallan? Where is the girl I once knew? Where has that princess gone?" Kallan searched his copper eyes. "You have no idea how much I wish to reach you," he said, "to take you away from the void." Kallan's rage recoiled, and the hardened shell of the grief-stricken queen remained. "You will not be able to maintain your focus in battle if you do not control your emotions," he said, repeating Eowth's words back to her. But Kallan held her stone gaze fixed on her captain, who at last released her wrists. "I'll ready the men," he said. Without a word, he lowered the hide flat behind him. "He was a Leoncifer, wasn't he?" Gudrun said. Kallan jerked her head around. The silence was all Gudrun needed to confirm what Kallan didn't deny. "I didn't dare say anything to the men," she said. "I felt he had enough to deal with Eric's lecture, so..." Eric sighed. Or Gudrun sighed. "Who was he?" "A mindless oaf out hoping for a quick romp," Kallan said. "He saw me and thought I was one of them." Gudrun nodded. "He was an ass," Kallan said. Gudrun smiled. Was he now? Only after Kallan was thoroughly uncomfortable with the topic did Gudrun sigh. "Never mind," she said, and helped Kallan peel the Leoncifer clothing from her body. "Not my business, so long as you maintain your focus and don't let feelings get in the way," Gudrun droned on, lulling Kallan back to Dagon's words. Kallan closed her eyes against the pang and forced herself to breathe as Gudrun prepared her for battle. Focus, she chided. The war, the plan, King Rune. She felt the cold of her elding sword. Kallan opened her eyes and raised her blade before her until the double-edged reflected back the fire's light. Kallan tightened her grip on the hilt, letting the solid weight ground her back to where she needed to be. She would lead her army through the pine forest of Alfheim to battle at Schwandal. She would fight to take back what she had lost. She would fight to usurp their king, and then she would kill him. Okay, thank you very much for listening. This was Chapter 15 of Dolor and Shadow, and I will be here again tomorrow for Chapter 16 and 17. Thank you again.